Royal Guard Edward Bolton's boot connected sharply with the side of the crying girl, her small body crumpling onto the rain-slicked cobblestones. The echo of the impact reverberated through the palace courtyard, silencing the faint murmurs of onlookers. She let out a muffled cry as her frail hands clutched a bundle tightly to her chest, trembling in the cold drizzle. "Move along!" Edward barked, looming over her with the rigid authority of a royal guard. His uniform of crimson and gold glimmered under the gray sky, and his boots, polished to perfection, did not bear even a drop of mud from the girl's fall. He turned away to scan the crowd that was closing in on the edges of the courtyard, their shocked faces feeding his simmering irritation. "This is royal property, not a place for beggars." The girl said nothing. She struggled to sit up, her wet hair plastered to her pale face as she gasped for air. Her bundle had partially come undone in her fall, and Edward's keen eyes caught a glint of something golden within the folds of the dirty cloth. He frowned, stepping closer. "Stand up!" The voice cracked like a whip, but she just huddled in more tightly, clutching the bundle tighter, as if her life depended on it. The only sounds now were the whispered rain and the rustling of the crowd, the air thick with tension. And as Edward stooped to snatch the bundle from her embrace, it fell away sufficiently to disclose its contents. A chain of gold, to which an escutcheon of brilliance still adhered, the bearing of which Edward instantly recognized: his family crest. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The girl's wide, tear-filled eyes darted between Edward and the necklace. The murmurs from the crowd swelled, carrying words Edward didn't want to hear. "Royal crest? What's she doing with that? And could she be—" "Where did you get that?" Edward demanded, in a suddenly lower voice, laced with an unfamiliar unease. He reached for the necklace, but before his fingers could graze the chain, the girl's survival instincts kicked in. In a flash, she scrambled to her feet and darted away, dodging puddles and slipping into the shadows of a nearby alley. Edward only hesitated a split second, until instinct stirred him to motion. Surging forward, the sea of faces turned to shut off his path, but it was too late already, because she was out of sight, small frame whisked into a labyrinth of narrow streets about the palace. The murmurs became hushed accusations, and Edward felt the weight of their blame lean against him. His heart began to pound in his chest as he looked back towards the shining necklace that was engraved in his memory, the royal crest, in the hands of a street child. It just didn't make sense. "What have you done?" a voice cut through the rain, trembling with fury. Edward turned to see an elderly man staring at him, his face pale and stricken. "Do you know who she might be?" Edward's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He turned on his heel, striding back toward the palace steps, his mind racing with questions he couldn't yet face. It was then, as Edward reached the gates, that a sudden movement caught his eye. A hooded figure standing under the shadow of the arch. Its face hidden, but its gaze unmistakably fixed on him. Edward froze, instinctive warnings roaring in his head. There was something not just wrong about it, but dangerous. The rain poured harder, heavier, as Sir Edward Bolton paced back and forth in his quarters, the polished marble walls doing little to muffle the turmoil in his mind. The faint outline of the royal crest haunted him, flashing before his eyes every time he closed them. A mere street beggar. How could she have had that? His instincts told him this was no coincidence, yet every reasonable thought screamed otherwise. He slammed a fist onto the oak desk, rattling the delicate trinkets atop it. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered low, but his tone was taut with frustration. His mind went back to the girl's wide, terror-stricken eyes, her desperate clinging to that bundle. A thief? A spy? Or... The thought sent a pang through his chest. Somebody connected to the royal family? A sharp knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. "Come in!" he barked, masking his unease with the commanding tone of a guard used to unquestioned authority. A young footman entered, his expression pale and uneasy. "Sir Bolton," he began, his voice barely audible over the rain pelting against the windows. "There's been an inquiry from the king's chamber." Edward stiffened, his blood running cold. "What kind of inquiry?" The footman hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "A servant reported seeing a girl near the palace grounds earlier today. They mentioned—" He gulped, visibly ill at ease. "A gold necklace with the royal crest." Edward's stomach churned. He kept his expression neutral, his voice carefully measured. "And what did the chamber request?" "To find out whether anyone among the guard had seen anything peculiar. They're anxious." The footman's voice shook, and Edward heard that he was trying to mute something there. "And?" Edward prompted, his voice low and close. "Speak honestly." The footman flinched. "The steward of the king suggested it might pertain to the disappearance of the daughter of Lady Eleanor." The words hung in the air like an implacable fate. Edward's chest tightened. Lady Eleanor, the king's cousin, had been in mourning for weeks after her daughter Amelia had vanished during a royal procession. The search had been discreet but relentless, and the implications of the girl's presence near the palace, holding that necklace, began to claw at his resolve. "Dismissed," Edward said shortly, waving the footman away. As the door closed, he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. If the girl was Amelia, he had just kicked the missing child of the king's own cousin. The thought made him feel as though the air in the room had been sucked away, leaving him gasping for breath. The courtyard was deserted as Edward made his way outside, pulling his cloak tight against the downpour. He went back the way he had come, his eyes scanning the slick cobblestones for any sign of the girl, the necklace, the crest, Amelia. It was too much, yet he could not turn his back on it. His position and possibly his life depended on finding the truth before the royal chamber demanded answers. As he neared the alley where the girl had disappeared, something caught his eye. A small, muddy footprint hardly visible in the dim light. His pulse quickened. He followed the trail deeper into the shadows, the alleys narrowing and twisting like a labyrinth. A muffled cough arrested him. Edward froze, hand going instinctively to the hilt of his ceremonial sword. He peered into the darkness, his eyes quickly adapted to the gloom. And then he saw her. She was crouching behind a stack of broken crates, holding tightly onto the bundle against her chest. She was breathing raggedly, and her eyes darted to him as if she felt his presence. Edward moved closer, and the boots crunched in wet gravel. "You!" he called out, keeping his voice low but clear. The girl flinched. Her arms tightened around the bundle. "Come here, now!" She didn't move. Her gaze flicked behind him instead. Edward turned, but there was nothing there. He turned back to find the girl gone, deeper into the alleys. Frustration churned within him. He gave chase, his boots splashing puddles as he rounded one corner after another. The girl was quick, her small frame slipping through cracks and crevices he couldn't. Then he heard it, a harsh, almost indistinguishable sound, a rustling, followed by a low voice. Edward froze, pushing himself against the damp stone wall as his heart raced wildly. Popping his head around the corner, he saw the girl again. This time, however, she was not alone. A figure knelt beside her, dressed in a cloak, its face shrouded in darkness. They were speaking in hushed tones. The girl's hands were gesturing wildly as she clutched the necklace. Edward strained to hear, but the rain swallowed their words. His instincts were screaming at him to interfere, but something was preventing him from doing so. Who was this stranger, and why should he help her? Edward clutched his sword tightly and leaned closer to catch at least a fragment of their conversation. Suddenly, the figure in the cloak turned, its hood falling back enough for Edward to glimpse its face. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a face he knew, but the cold, calculating expression and the scar cutting across the jaw told a great deal. This was no innocent bystander. Before Edward could utter a word, the stranger seized the girl's hand and was off, dragging her into the maze of alleys. Edward sprang forward, the soles of his boots slapping against the cobblestones. But as he turned the next corner, they were gone. The alley was deserted, except for the faint smell of damp earth and the lingering sense of violence. Edward stood frozen, his chest heaving as he stared into the empty shadows. He'd lost her again, but this time the stakes were higher. Whoever the cloaked figure was, they weren't just helping the girl escape. They had a purpose. And Edward couldn't shake the feeling that he was now entangled in something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Edward was in the narrow alley. The rainwater collected around his boots while his eyes probed into the maze of shadows. His chest heaved after the chase, while in his mind, questions came tumbling around in the darkness of the instant moment. The girl, the necklace, the scar-faced stranger. Every fragment of what happened felt like part of some major web, one that he could not see himself trapped within. "Where are they?" he muttered, the sound drowned out by the rain. He whipped around, his eyes scouring the thin alleys for anything. Then he spotted it. A little shred of cloth caught on a rusty nail protruding from a box. He yanked it loose and held it up toward the faint light of a nearby lantern. It was wet and frayed, but the pattern was unmistakable. The pale blue thread matched the tattered cloak she had been wrapped in. Edward's stomach twisted. This wasn't some random street child. The quality of the fabric was far too fine. It confirmed his growing suspicion. She wasn't an ordinary beggar. The dripping of the wet cloak from Edward's shoulder, he strode through to the archives, the clean marble floors beneath his feet showing spots. The storm had muted the usual hum of activity along the great halls, which was usually filled with chatter. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Within, rows of shelved, well-maintained records reached the vaulted ceiling. Edward looked around the room, his gaze settling upon a man who sat with his head buried in the work at a desk. "Archivist," he said gruffly, marching up to the elderly man. The old man started up and began to quiver as he clutched his feather within midair. "Sir Bolton," the archivist stammered, "how can I help you?" "I need records on Lady Eleanor's daughter," Edward ordered. "Everything you have. Now." The archivist blinked, his hands fumbling with the quill. "The king ordered all information on Lady Eleanor's child sealed during the search," he said cautiously. "Only those with express permission." Edward slammed a hand onto the desk, silencing the man. "This is a matter of palace security. If you delay, I'll ensure the king hears of your incompetence." The archivist paled and nodded quickly, shuffling toward a set of locked cabinets. A moment later, he returned with a thin, leather-bound dossier. "This is all I have," he said, sliding it across the desk. Edward snatched it up and opened it, his eyes scanning the sparse information. Amelia Eleanor Ashbourne, aged 8, last seen in the company of her nanny during a royal procession. The description of her dark hair and delicate features matched the girl he had kicked in the courtyard. But then Edward's eyes landed on a detail that sent his blood to ice. A hand-to-catch of the necklace she had been wearing the day she disappeared stared at him, identical to the one clutched in her tiny hands. He slammed the dossier shut. "Is this all?" he demanded. The archivist hesitated. "There were rumors," he said softly. "Some said she was taken, others that she ran away, but none were confirmed." Edward's jaw tightened. If Amelia had truly run away, how had she ended up here? And who was helping her? He turned on his heel and strode out of the archives, the dossier tucked under his arm. The storm raging, Edward was back in the alley where he had last seen the girl. He had to go back and retrace his steps to find the stranger who took her. But this time he wasn't alone. 2 other guards, both younger and less experienced than Edward, flanked him as they scoured the narrow streets. "Are you sure this is necessary, Sir Bolton?" one of them asked, a slight quiver in his tone. "It's just a child." Edward shot him a look that silenced him. "This isn't just about a child," he growled. "It's about the security of the crown." They moved deeper into the alleys, their torches casting flickering shadows on the damp walls. The air felt heavier here, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Then one of the guards called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Over here!" Edward hastened to his side, his torch lit. It was a rude camp in the depths of the alcove, a still smoldering fire with remnants strewn on the ground. And then he saw the piece of parchment folded and lying upon an open crate nearby. Edward snatched it up, unfolded it, and with a jerk in his breathing read the few scrawled words in red ink. "The girl is not safe here. Take her to the harbor at first light. The ship to Ashport leaves at dawn." Edward's grip on the parchment tightened. Whoever the scarred stranger was, they were planning to smuggle Amelia out of the city. He turned to the guards, his voice low and commanding. "We split up. Search every alley near the docks. We can't let them leave the city." As the guards scattered, Edward's mind raced. The stakes had escalated far beyond an act of cruelty in the courtyard. If the girl reached the harbor, he would lose not only her, but any chance to undo the mistake now threatening his career, and possibly his life. Edward delved deeper into the alleys, his torch dancing in the wind. The rain subsided, leaving only the chill of dampness in its wake, seeping into his bones. He rounded a corner and froze. There, ahead of him, stood the scarred stranger in the shadows. The cloak billowed slightly as he turned to face him, the glint of a dagger catching the light from the torch. "You should have stayed in your palace, guard," the stranger sneered. Edward drew his sword as his muscles coiled in tension. "Where is the girl?" he asked. The stranger sneered, inching closer. "She's beyond your reach, and soon so will I be." Before Edward had time to reply, the stranger leaped forward in a flash of steel upon steel, the blades hissing with sparks, clanging with a deafening ring. The 2 blades met again and again within the close space of the alley. The stranger was agile and swift in his movements. Another blow pressed Edward down to one knee, gasping, his hold on the sword stronger. Then, in one sudden brutal shove, the stranger knocked him off balance, sending him crashing into a stack of barrels. By the time Edward regained his footing, the stranger was gone, the alley empty once more. But this time, they had left something behind, a bloodied scrap of blue fabric clutched in Edward's hand. It wasn't over, not yet. The storm had passed, leaving the city swathed in an eerie stillness, but Edward's mind was anything but calm. His breathing was shallow, his fingers wrapped tightly around the bloodied shred of blue fabric while he stood in the deserted alley. The girl was close. So were her captors. He could feel it. Yet the stranger's skill had shaken him. This was no ordinary thief or mercenary. Whoever they were willing to kill for her. Edward pressed on, his footsteps heavier now, each echoing with the weight of his failure. Ahead of him, the docks were a maze of groaning ships, abandoned crates, and shadowy figures darting in and out of sight. The salty air stung his nose, mingling with the smell of rain-soaked wood. He glanced out to sea, where the first light of dawn was creeping over the water. The ship to Ashport would leave very soon. He saw the two guards he had sent out earlier, both standing near a cluster of barrels, their faces pale and tense. "Report," Edward ordered as he approached, his voice sharper than he intended. One of the guards swallowed hard, avoiding Edward's gaze. "Sir, we've found no sign of the girl, but there's been activity near Pier 9, a few suspicious figures loading crates." "Crates?" Edward's jaw clenched. "And you didn't investigate?" The younger guard hesitated. "We thought it might be best to wait for you, sir. The figures? They were armed." Cowards, Edward thought, but he didn't waste breath voicing it. "Show me." Pier 9 was a far cry from the silent alleys Edward had left behind. Here the air vibrated with tension, the creak of ropes and the soft lapping of waves breaking the stillness. Ahead, a ship loomed, its silhouette imposing against the faint light of dawn. Figures moved swiftly up and down the gangplank, carrying crates onto the vessel. Edward crouched behind a stack of barrels, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. His pulse quickened when he spotted the girl. She was there, huddled near the base of the gangplank, her small frame dwarfed by the scarred stranger who stood beside her, barking orders to the men loading the ship. The girl's face was pale, her wide eyes darting frantically, as if searching for an escape. Edward's instincts roared to life. This was his chance to end it. He turned to the guards at his side. "Stay here and cover me," he hissed. "If things go wrong, signal the palace." "But sir," one of them began, his voice trembling. "I said stay here," Edward snapped, leaving no room for argument. He drew his sword, the weight of the steel grounding him as he moved silently toward the pier. He crept closer, his boots making barely a sound against the slick wood. The scarred stranger was focused on the crates, his back turned. Edward tightened his grip on his sword, his breath steady as he prepared to strike. But just as he was closing the distance, the girl's gaze locked onto him. Her eyes went wide, and she let out a small, involuntary gasp. The scarred man spun around, his dagger flashing in the dawn light. "So, the palace dog finally found us," the stranger sneered, his tone mocking but edged with menace. He pushed the girl behind him, his stance shifting into a fighter's crouch. "You should have stayed where you belonged, guard." Edward lunged, his sword swooping through the air. With a nearly inhuman swiftness, the stranger dodged and their blades clashed, spraying sparks. The clangor sent the dock workers scattering, their shouts echoing back from a distance. The fight was intense and swift. The stranger struck with a precision that made Edward block the blows continuously, his muscles taut. His opponent was not just skilled but relentless too, every move calculated in wearing him down. "You don't even know who she is, do you?" the stranger taunted as their blades locked. Edward pushed back with a growl, forcing the man to stumble. "She's not just some lost child. She's your reckoning." Edward's breath came in ragged gasps. "She's the king's blood," he spat, "and I'll see her returned." The stranger laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "The king's blood? You think you're saving her? You have no idea what you've stepped into." The words sent a chill down Edward's spine, but he didn't falter. He surged forward, forcing the stranger toward the edge of the pier. With a final powerful swing, he knocked the dagger from the man's hand and sent it skittering across the wood. The stranger staggered, his footing precarious. Edward raised his sword, the tip hovering inches from the man's throat. "Yield," he growled. But the scarred man smiled, his eyes gleaming with something dark and triumphant. "It's too late." Before Edward had time to act, the man whistled loudly. A figure burst out of the darkness, snatched the girl and pulled her toward the ship. Edward spun around as the girl shrieked, her voice slicing through the dawn like a knife. In that instant, the stranger launched himself at Edward, and both went tumbling through the air into the icy waters below. The shock of the cold stole Edward's breath as he flailed against the current, the world above him a blur of muffled shouts and slapping waves. When he finally surfaced, gasping for air, the ship was already drawing away from the dock. The girl stood on its deck, her tear-streaked face turned to him as the scar-faced stranger joined her, a mocking salute on his lips. Edward clung to the edge of the pier, his knuckles white, as he watched the ship disappear into the mist. He had failed. The girl was gone, and the weight of his mistake loomed over him, threatening to pull him under once more. Edward heaved himself onto the pier, his wet uniform clinging to his skin, his breathing ragged. The cold water had sapped his strength, but the sight of the ship disappearing into the fog reignited a fire in his chest. He slammed a fist against the wooden planks, the sound echoing in the eerie stillness. The girl was gone. Amelia. His failure burned like acid in his gut. The king's cousin's child, her fate now lost in the hands of a scarred stranger and whatever sinister forces had orchestrated this. "Sir!" The two guards he'd left behind came rushing toward him, their faces pale, their eyes wide with panic. "Are you injured? What happened?" Edward ignored their questions, pulling himself upright. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the weight of what had just occurred. "The ship," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Did you see the name? Anything?" The younger guard shook his head helplessly. "No, sir." It vanished too quickly. Edward swore under his breath, but then the older guard hesitated. His expression was at war within itself. "There's something else, sir. Someone left this just after you disappeared into the water." He held out a folded piece of parchment. Its edges were damp from the rain. Edward snatched it and unfolded it with shaking hands. The message inside was brief, but it hit him like a thunderclap. "Return to the palace. You've been looking in the wrong place all along." Edward's eyes narrowed, the weight of the words pressing down on him. "The wrong place?" he muttered. His mind raced. The docks, the ship, the girl, it had all felt like a diversion. But why, and for what purpose? The answer came unbidden: the palace. In just a few minutes, the big oak wood palace gates stormed open for a sodden, boot-clad Edward, who set a trail of water through to those spotless floors. Lively servants skipped out of his way into the finest suites of the royals, skimming through till the letter seemed fairly clear, that the actual danger wasn't out there amidst alleys nor aboard this ship. It was just inside of these walls, precisely inside the area he'd sworn to guard. Bursting into the king's private antechamber, Edward found the steward waiting for him. The older man looked startled, his usually composed demeanor cracking at the sight of Edward's disheveled state. "Sir Bolton, what is the meaning of this intrusion?" the steward demanded. "Where is the king?" Edward growled, his voice sharp enough to cut through stone. The steward hesitated, his eyes darting to the closed doors of the throne room. "He's in a private audience. You cannot—" Edward bullied past him and made the heavy doors fly open as he entered. The king sat at the head of the long table, flanked by a small council of advisors. At the center of that table was a figure Edward knew, scar and all. Edward's sword was in his hand before he realized it, the blade glinting in the torchlight as he pointed it directly at the man. "Your Majesty, that man! He's taken Amelia! He's behind the kidnapping!" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. The king's piercing gaze shifted between Edward and the scarred stranger, who stood unfazed, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're mistaken, Sir Bolton," the king said calmly, his voice like ice. "This man is here on my orders." Edward froze, the words not registering at first. "Your orders?" he repeated, lowering his blade slightly. "Your Majesty, he took Lady Eleanor's daughter. He's—" "Enough!" the king snapped, rising from his seat. "You've been chasing shadows, Edward. Amelia was never taken by force. She fled the palace of her own accord." The revelation hit Edward like a blow to the chest. "Fled? But why?" The scarred stranger finally spoke, his voice cold and sharp. "Because she knew the truth. About you. About this palace. About your king." He gestured toward the monarch with a slight sneer. "The child saw through the lies you've all been living under." "Lies?" Edward's mind reeled as the king said nothing, his face unreadable. But the stranger forged ahead. Amelia wasn't running away. She was running toward safety. From him. He pointed a gloved finger at the king, and his words seemed to resound within the chamber. She learned the truth of her bloodline, who her true father was. Gasps and murmurs exploded through the room. Edward recoiled a step, his grip on the sword in his hand slackening. "Her real father?" The words were like a foreign language in his mouth. "She's not Lady Eleanor's daughter," the stranger repeated, undeterred. "She's the king's illegitimate child, the rightful heir to the throne." The chamber fell into complete, stark silence. Edward's world was spinning. The pieces clicked. Her disappearance. The necklace. The secrecy concerning her. It wasn't just some sort of missing child case. It was about some kind of hidden threat to the crown. The king's face darkened, and his voice boomed as he spoke to Edward. "You have overstepped, Bolton. Your actions have jeopardized everything. Amelia's safety. The integrity of this palace. The trust of the people." Edward's knees buckled under with the weight of such a revelation. He had given his life to serve this crown, enforced its rule, protected its image. Yet, blinded by arrogance and blind loyalty, he had become a pawn in something far greater than he'd ever realized. The scarred stranger stepped closer, his piercing gaze fixed upon Edward. "You were so quick to punish that girl, so sure of your authority, but you never stopped to ask the right questions. You failed her." Edward dropped to his knees, his sword clattering to the floor. The enormity of his mistake crushed him. He had not only failed in the protection of Amelia, but had played a part in endangering her further. And as the scarred stranger leaned down, his voice lowered to a near whisper. The truth always comes out, guard. The question is, will you stand with it or against it? Edward's head bowed under the weight of the stranger's words now settling upon him. This was no longer about loyalty to the crown. It was about redemption, a truth he had been ignoring. Edward knelt on the cold marble floor of the throne room, his head bowed under the weight of his failure. The scarred stranger's words echoed in his mind. The truth always comes out. The room was silent now, the stunned murmurs of the king's advisors fading into a heavy stillness. He had always thought himself a man of honor, loyal to the crown and realm, but that was what had blinded him. He had acted without thinking, without compassion, and this was what had resulted. Sir Bolton, the king's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, sharp and commanding. Edward lifted his head to meet the monarch's gaze. The king's face was etched with anger, but behind it lay something else, fear. You have caused irreparable harm, not only to Lady Eleanor, but to this entire palace. Edward opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What was he to say? That he was sorry? That he had acted rashly? None of it would undo the damage he had caused. The scarred stranger stepped forward, his presence commanding as he addressed the king. Your Majesty, this isn't about Sir Bolton. This is about the rot at the heart of your rule. Your child, was forced to flee for her life because of corruption and deceit festering within these walls. Blame him if you must, but the truth is this palace failed her long before he did. The king's jaw flexed, his hands whitening on the edge of the table. For a moment it seemed he would erupt at any instant in anger, then his shoulders sagged beneath the weight of the stranger's words. Where is she now? He asked, quieter, even a little hesitant. The scar above the stranger's eyebrow twisted, his expression softening, but his eyes never lost their intensity. She's safe for now, but she won't return unless she's certain this place will not destroy her. The king looked at Edward. And you, Sir Bolton? What have you to say for yourself? Edward forced himself to his feet, his soaked uniform clinging to his frame. He straightened his spine, though the shame in his heart weighed heavy. Your Majesty, I failed. I let my arrogance and blind loyalty cloud my judgment. I saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be dealt with, and for that I am truly sorry. The king's eyes narrowed. Sorry is not enough. Your actions nearly cost Amelia her life. Edward nodded, his voice firm despite the turmoil within him. I know, and I will spend the rest of my life making it right if you'll let me. Let me find her. Let me protect her. Not for the crown, but because it is the right thing to do. The scar-faced stranger arched a brow. The faintest tugging at the corner of his lips suggested a smile. That is most noble of you to say, the same man who kicked her into the mud, of course. Edward winced, though held his place. I cannot take back my actions, but I can ensure she never faces such fear again. The room was silent as the king regarded Edward, his expression inscrutable. Finally he spoke. Very well. You will have one chance, Sir Bolton. Find her. Bring her back. And when you do, prove to her, not to me, not to this court, that you are more than the man she saw in the courtyard. Edward left the throne room with a renewed sense of purpose. Though the guilt still weighed heavily on his shoulders, the scarred stranger followed him into the corridor, his steps measured and deliberate. You've got a long road ahead, guard, the stranger said, his tone less biting now. Earning her trust won't be easy. Edward nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. I don't expect it to be, but I'll do whatever it takes. The stranger studied him for a moment, then reached into his cloak and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. She's not far, but don't expect her to welcome you with open arms. Edward took the parchment, his hands steadied despite the storm in his heart. Thank you. The stranger only nodded curtly. Don't thank me yet. You have much to atone for. By the time Edward reached the edge of the city, the sun was well up, and the parchment guided him to a small, secluded inn. He drew up his horse, his heart pounding, and dismounted at the door. The girl sat inside by a crackling fire, wrapped in her blanket, small and harmless. Her wide eyes met his as he entered, and across her face danced fear. Edward stopped a few feet away, lowering himself to one knee to meet her gaze. He pulled his sword off and laid it on the ground beside him, a sign of peace. Amelia, he whispered, his voice shaking. I am so sorry. I didn't see you for who you are. I only saw what I thought you weren't. She stared at him, her grip tightening on the edge of the blanket. Why are you here? To make things right, Edward said simply. Not for the king, not for the palace. For you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I will protect you no matter what it takes. Amelia studied him for one long moment, her eyes unreadable. Then she did speak, her voice not much above a whisper. "You hurt me." The muscles in Edward's throat jerked. "I know," he said, and his voice cracked. "And I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life." Heath-strewn silence continued to stretch between them and was heavy with unspoken undercurrents. Then slowly, she nodded. "You can stay," she said softly, "but only because I don't trust the others." Edward nodded, and his eyes stung with tears. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. With the passing of days turning to weeks, Edward dedicated himself to the protection of Amelia, not as a royal guard, but as a man in search of redemption. He began to listen, and to look beyond his assumptions to the weight of his actions. Through her he found not just a purpose, but also a truth he had long overlooked. That loyalty meant nothing without compassion, authority, nothing without humility. It would be Amelia's final decision, of course, but there was one thing Edward knew with clarity. He would stand beside her, no longer as protection to the crown, but as protector of her future.